Welcome. I'm Chelsea Goldberg, and today I am delighted to be joined by a very important guest talking about very important topics. Sarah Thompson, Executive Managing Director of Glassroom Toronto and one of Canada's most respected media leaders. As former president of Dentsu Canada and chief strategy officer at Mindshare WPP, she has driven growth for leading brands while helping shape a more equitable media landscape in Canada. She's a passionate advocate for inclusive, ethical media investment with a focus on supporting Canadian content, diverse creators, LGBTQ+, and marginalized voices. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I really look forward to this conversation.
Great. I would love to kick it off and just hear about something that everyone doesn't know about you. Something fun, interesting, some fun facts that you'd like to share with the group.
I mean, there's a lot of fun facts. I don't know from how many speaking engagements I do or how many podcasts I've done in history if I have anything left that I haven't told people. But I'll give you my top 5 random things about Sarah Thompson. 1, I can play 3 different instruments. I can read music, so I can play the piano, the drums, and the guitar. So I could be my own band. 2, I, at this point this year, have read 110 books, most of them in the sapphic, women-loving women romance genre.
Wow.
3, I've seen Brandi Carlile in concert 39 times. So this definitely gives me my calling card as a lesbian. 4, I am a recent fan of the PWHL. Again, just proving that I do belong to the community. And I think number 5 is, for all of the things that I love about media, one of my favorite jobs of all time was when I actually worked at a TV broadcaster. And in that moment, in that time, I got to interview Katrina Balfe from the TV show Outlander, which sometimes I come across the clip of me interviewing her, but it was one of those moments in life where I don't believe a person like that physically can exist in the world, but so she did. But I love the television show Outlander.
Love it.
And I loved that job. I loved that job.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I'm going to need some recommendations on those sapphic novels for sure.
I mean, I have oodles of them. I'm actually an ARC reader, so I get early editions now for authors because of how many books I read. Mm-hmm.
I love when I get served those TikTok ads or those TikTok reels about what novels to read and like same with TV shows. Those are my favorite, like top 5 right now, top 10 right now. So I'll definitely need your recommendations. Okay, let's get into it. So we have a lot to cover today, which I'm excited about. Kicking it off, you spent your career shaping how brands show up in culture. Can you share a little bit about that journey and why this work really matters to you?
Early in my career, I actually wanted to be a journalist, and I opted not to, and I started my career in public relations. The reason for public relations was, at the time, you got just a better paycheck than journalists, even though I have a love of journalism. I think my career came full circle when I ended up in the paid media space after doing stints in data and analytics and working at a creative agency. But the biggest thing for me in the last sort of decade has been coming full circle against that journalism background, which is making sure stories are being told about Canadians for Canadians and all the communities and all the facets, be it race, sexual preference, gender, making sure those journalists exist, those publications exist, because they're so important to the fabric of our identity, our culture, of seeing each other in society. That really has been sort of the hallmark for me, is that I've now fight the good fight of trying to keep that industry going in our country. The other part of that I think is really important from how I look at the world is, if you are a part of a community that often isn't recognized, either because you haven't had human rights or rights to get married historically, which is the benefit of a lot of the LGBTQ and queer communities they've had a lot of the benefits of that. But I grew up in a professional avenue that didn't have those things, that you recognize how quickly human rights can be stripped of you without having stories told and communities exposed to the plot lines, the life that we live like everybody else. There's something to be said, because without those stories, you can end up in a very fear-based culture of otherness. So I appreciate everything of my career has come full circle from wanting to be a journalist to advocating for the profession and all of the entertainment and stories that come as part of that.
Yeah, definitely. And also being a part of the community myself, I feel that so wholeheartedly. I majored in journalism myself, so I completely resonate with that. And yeah, to your point, it's so important that we fight the good fight and we continue on having a hand in it. In that context, when you think about reaching marginalized communities, including LGBTQ plus and Indigenous audiences, for example, how do you move from simply targeting those groups in your work to truly showing up for them in a meaningful and authentic way?
Well, it's interesting because I come from a media planning and strategy background for the most part. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at audience data, media partners, choices that you have, communities across Canada. And if you're a planner, it's a very easy thing to fall into the law of average. You can do a media plan against a particular demographic, and you can end up with a very average look of things. But when you average it, you miss on nuance. This is the challenge when you work in an algorithmic reality as well of where media is gone. You can have something that ends up being an interest graph, but even by the nature of the interest graph, it can be exclusionary. So as much as we have so much data at our fingertips, more often than not, we're not challenging what is absent or who is absent from a media plan or a media strategy. So I go back to, you can approach anything by an interest graph, but that can also be biased. You can end up trying to map it geographically, so where a person lives, or a community-based approach. In Canada, that's our FSA or our postal code. In the United States, it's your zip code. To understand, like, based on the community, what are the demographics, community like? And then you can end up going straight to publication. Who are the readerships of these creators? Who are the audiences that they're connecting with? And so we like to do the heavy look and look at all three of those to understand the physicality of how you live, the creators that you connect with, and what are your interests. But if you look at anything just through the lens of one of those, you were probably in a media strategy excluding somebody that you didn't even know you were excluding. And if you're doing an average, you will end up predominantly with a heavier weighting against middle-aged men who typically respond to panels the most. And you're going to miss on nuance. So for us, we like to look at what gets you scale, but then what's the nuance of who do they trust, what are the quality environments, what are the places they spend the most time versus just chasing them around with a cookie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like we see this all the time with brands that we work with, is when we take a look at, say, a block list, for instance, right? They're so outdated. There's words, there's terms, there's concepts and themes on there that just don't exist anymore, or they do still exist, but like you said, there's so much nuance to it. And so by blocking that content, you're blocking really, really great creators, a part of great communities that have a lot of great things to say about certain issues and certain topics within certain communities. And so that's really, being part of the social ecosystem, really like what I'm excited about in the work that we do daily is inclusivity, and how can we include more of that content to avoid a lot of that blockage that's happening across the space.
It's interesting to me too, just on that comment of LGBTQ plus is one of those communities that often ends up in those block lists. Mm-hmm. But it's because it becomes sexualized, right? Versus looking at individuals and the life that they actually lead and the interests that they have. And your sort of, let's say YouTube, your YouTube channel and my YouTube channel probably don't even look the same, even though we're part of that community. But there's content that we want creators to continue to produce that often ends up being sort of devalued and no advertisers. But you could reach someone like me or someone like you,
Yep.
which is a huge opportunity. And I think that sexualization or thinking that the content is inherently sexualized is also kind of a misnomer, that by going in those and excluding them, you're excluding something. And you're treating it in the same way as you would some of the most nefarious content on the internet. And that's not true. Like, I don't know what your YouTube channel is like, but mine is mostly supercuts of television shows.
Yep.
Some political people talking about finance and business, but sometimes it is, a comic from a lesbian comic, or watching, professional women's sports. Like, there's a lot of opportunity within that to find means of connecting with our audiences. But if you decide that you're going to eliminate it, there's things that we trust and we value, that brands just decide isn't of value to them because they've sexualized that content, even though it's not inherently sexual.
Yeah, 100%. And it's such a blanketed approach to media buying. Like you said, it's the law of average, and it's really taking that blanketed approach, which can sometimes exist for scale, but there has to be nuance to it. Building on that. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to that. The nuance of it is such an important thing as we end up in an algorithmic reality, because everybody is creating their own sort of paradigm, and we want these personalized relationships. But the opposite is also true in nuance, that if you are targeting, say, for instance, financial influencers within YouTube, well, average, those are men, typically of a certain age. And if you want to influence something like the $1 trillion transfer that's happening towards women from a financial perspective, you need to figure out how to connect with those audiences. So it's really important to understand, again, who are you excluding by deciding who you're including?
Yep. Yeah, there's such a balance to both. And building on that, many brands are still trying to turn DEI, that term, and from intention into action. And what are the signals for you that a brand's doing that right, or a campaign's genuinely getting it right?
It's funny. I look at it as like I don't need rainbow washing from a brand anymore. I always appreciate it when a brand has diversity, either transgender or something along the LGBTQ, or inclusion of Black, BIPOC, Indigenous communities in their advertising. But I often find that's not for me. That component of it is just so that we can generally see each other in the world, that there is a mosaic of individuals that live their lives, and it actually helps from a parasocial relationship with the content, that it eases sort of political point of views as well of brands who are more inclusive of the choices and the people and the storylines that they include in their advertising. From my perspective, just, I don't need a bunch of rainbows or to say that you are overtly for my community, but it is important that brands support LGBTQ plus creators or other content that I'm consuming where they are usually already at a disadvantage. Algorithms sometimes throttle them. They're generating things that we value. So to me, it's where brands actually have decided to do the heavy lifting and look at that nuance and remove, LGBTQ from their block list, or look at creators in that space that really supports DE&I without being overtly DE&I, where I know that that's become politicized, especially in the United States. I get the advantage of living in Canada, where we don't have as many issues with that term. But if we're talking about not just equality, but equity, then it's important to make sure that we are lifting up all voices from a brand perspective. And I respond to the brands that decided that yes, they are going to be in front of this supercut of my favorite television show, or YouTubers like Rose and Rosie, who are a famous UK lesbian couple who I followed for 15 years. When you see brands supporting them, that's a good signal to me, and really, really important to our community to include them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel I have like a different type of feeling towards those brands too. Like
Go for
it's
it.
not just oh, they showed up, but I just have a different viewpoint. Like there was actually probably LGBTQ plus people in that room, or people of certain communities in that room making the decision of how we're going to show up against this type of content, or where we're going to contextually curate our media buys to show up for these communities. So I just feel like there was people in that room making those decisions that helped me see that brand in a different light.
Yep. I think there's a lot to be said for the allies too that sit in the room who fight the good fight for our community of being more inclusive, and inclusive of everything, because it is very easy to just execute a very basic media plan and a media buy against an audience and just be like, I'm done and I got scale.
Yep.
It's a much harder thing to spend some time actually getting to know the environment, the creators, the opportunities that arise where you can be a little bit more intentional with how you are planning and buying your media. And I think that's the challenge. You can self-serve any media execution. You can have some basic inclusion, exclusion terms, but are you being intentional with your investment and really thinking that through? This is what I challenge clients to do all the time, is because I want clients to find opportunity. And sometimes opportunity isn't presented into the thing that any other brand could do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. As you mentioned, in the market of Canada, where cultural nuance, like we mentioned, is so important, especially when working with Indigenous communities. How do you approach that responsibility with care and the context it requires for that nuance?
I think a lot of it is really having spent a lot of time in truth and reconciliation dialogue and understanding the communities, and getting educated myself, and being curious about the creators that actually engage, and taking my own sort of privileged bias of how I grew up in a middle-class family in southwestern Ontario from the equation, and not judging the content based on my lived experience is a huge component of what we all need to do, because it exists because somebody values it. It tells a story. And the Indigenous community in Canada is vast and as distinct in regions, by language, by culture, by history, by the challenges that they have with truth and reconciliation in Canada, about how they're treated under the Charter Rights of Freedom, and all the issues that they have. So it can end up being politicized, but that's because that's their truth. And that doesn't mean that you should necessarily back away from that when it is an opportunity for people to have dialogue. And I think this is the same with how any inclusion and exclusion happen, is like a brand next to hard news. You don't want to be in that environment. You want to be very careful. You don't want to support news. And while you do have to be mindful of the context, being mindful of the context also means understanding that if the publication or the creator is trusted by that audience, and it is legitimate and fact-checked and high quality, but it is expressing a point of view or an opinion, that doesn't make it a bad place to advertise. Where you end up in dangerous spaces is when it's conspiracy theory or completely against like facts that are readily available. And this is what's happened in the United States. Then you can start being more discerning. But just sort of taking one big swath of the population and saying it's politicized and therefore I'm not going to advertise there, also weakens their voice and being able to speak up or speak to truth. of their lived experience. So yeah, again, being intentional is so important with how you select creators and who you want to work with, and doing your research and going and watching them and vetting them carefully. And that to me is the heavy lifting, because you could completely ignore that population just by your own unconscious bias to it.
Yeah, it's so true. And with our background in journalism, it's like we have to continue to support quality journalism and journalists, right? So by completely removing news and politics from all campaigns, we're not doing that, right? So we have to understand what are the quality journalists and publications that are putting out meaningful content that is resonating with the audience that reads it, and doing that in an authentic way, but not completely getting rid of it all. So
yeah, you can end up in a really interesting place too if you decide that the only place you advertise is the place that you want to agree with.
Yeah, so true.
And that just creates a vicious cycle of, is it not for all of us to debate topics? Is it not for all of us to stress test things or come with our own experience to the table and have a discussion? And I think even when you think about the way that the internet is formed, it's very easy for all of us to sit back and say, either I'm going to engage in this conversation, but I'm going to be completely anonymous, or I'm not going to engage in it at all or support it. And these feel very paradoxical.
Yeah.
Because in truth, you want to have differing point of views. Otherwise, we end up in a place of you don't see an otherness, or you don't challenge the way you think about events. And you need it in a fact-based space, 100%. But there's a difference between an Indigenous creator's point of view of actions around a pipeline going in through their community versus the telling of it from a mainstream media publication, right? We should be able to understand people's stories and where they come from, and it's important for brands to be open to that opportunity and be very cognizant of, again, what they don't support by their choices that they're making.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about the role of media, where do you see platforms like YouTube creating more space to elevate diverse voices in ways traditional channels haven't historically been able to in the past? How have you seen social platforms like transform this from traditional channels?
Well, I mean, if you think about it from there always is that conversation that happens right now, the comparison between TV and YouTube. And I think one of the areas that we forget about the differences of, and I just recently was talking to someone about heated rivalry as it came to production in Canada. That's years of process. That's production teams, that's story creators, that's casting, that's approvals, that's getting it to air, right? So it's a different journey when you have a television show to getting it on air. It's not a quick hit. Versus in the YouTube creator space, they have direct relationships with their audiences, and they can talk about things in the moment that are important to them. And you can even apply that to news, right? So it's always like a yin and the yang. I would never say one replaces the other, even though we often say like YouTube scale and cost per points and all of this stuff. But where I see the YouTube opportunity, and why in particular we leveraged it for a recent campaign with Channel Factory, is because we know we have to be very choiceful when speaking with these audiences of the voices and creators that we were working with. And that required more heavy lifting and thinking and intention than just doing a straight up YouTube execution of a buy, because we want to be in front of those people. We want to be in front of the audiences that these creators are connecting with. And that work is so important and slightly different, right? Because in some instances, I do need, a connected TV or a TV scale in our country for a campaign. Sometimes I can be much more surgical with YouTube and find the creators and those audiences that add up to the opportunity that I can also yield. Sometimes it's both. And this is where like partnering and working with the right partners becomes so important for us to achieve that. Because we could have executed on a campaign on YouTube on our own, as can any agency. But we wanted to be very mindful and choiceful of where this brand appeared, how it appeared, with what audiences did it appear, in front of what creators, which creators are the ones that make the most amount of sense. That was the heavy lifting that needed to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, when I started Channel Factory 5 years ago, that really wasn't a thing, which is so crazy to think about. And when we launched Conscious Voices in 2020, that really was like the stepping stone for all of this. And to think that we weren't really doing that prior to, understanding the nuance, really understanding the creators, giving them a voice, giving these marginalized communities an opportunity to monetize their content that they're creating and connect with brands in a different way is kind of mind-blowing to me that, it's really been like 5-6 years that this is taken off, and again, will continue to show up and be such a big part of brand execution in the future.
Yeah, I think we often think of scale as the be-all, end-all, but context and quality also matter. And you can't judge quality within an environment, especially when it comes to Indigenous or BIPOC or LGBTQ+, because the audience is deciding in that regard. And I need to understand who is the audience connecting with from a creator perspective, how has it changed, how it's evolved, right? I'm an older crop of LGBTQ+. So the YouTubers that I follow versus the YouTubers that someone else that is part of the lesbian community is going to be completely different. And I can't walk into that just thinking, I'm going to get everybody without really doing the legwork of who are those top creators? How engaged are they? What type of content are they producing? That's what you're looking at. If you want to compare YouTube to TV, it's programming. It's still programming and context and audience and all of those details. You can't overlook those things. And I think we often want to do the easy thing in those platforms rather than the most effective. It's easy to be efficient. It's harder to be effective.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I love that line. Okay, switching gears, on a personal level, what have you learned or what has stayed with you from working so closely on campaigns centered around impact and representation throughout your career?
I think a few things. I think to your point before, if you don't have a voice that speaks to who are we excluding or marginalized communities or factoring that in, or just a checks and balance to that in the planning process, even looking at the data bias that you have based on the planning data that you're using, it's very easy to create a campaign that ignores people. Like, you want to have attention, but also you can create a campaign that completely ignores vast swaths of the population. And diversity is not something that goes away. People of color in Canada now have grown exponentially because of immigration. Our Indigenous communities are some of the fastest growing segments of our population in our country. You have language diversity, you have sexual preference, you have gender diversity, right? So it's an area where if we're not really thinking about more than like an 18 to 54 demographic, or you're just thinking, I only want to find gamers, these are very surface level approaches to how media is actually consumed, especially when you want to break through an algorithmic reality, because it's not it's not a shared experience anymore. Versus, like tentpole television. YouTube is not, you have a shared experience with other people who may be watching that creator, but you and I do not have a shared experience in how we look at those platforms. And that's such an important nuance to understand, is how do you intersect with, everybody has a different channel feed. Everybody has a different way that the algorithm is evolving and adapting. And that's true of all of the platforms, because they're trying to figure out what you want, what you like, how long can I keep you staying on that platform, if I keep feeding you more of the same content. And brands need to start understanding and marketers need to start understanding is that there's such nuance. While you want scale, you need to understand context and nuance and really spend a lot of time thinking about the who you actually want to reach and the how through the creators that you're working with, because it's not something that is a line in a plan from an influencer or a platform perspective. On the campaign that we just worked on with Channel Factory, we did use creators. So we did do a few select creators in Canada, and they were carefully chosen. Mm-hmm. And then the environments that we worked with within Channel Factory to sort of elevate that and make the campaign bigger for those segments of the population, we spent a lot of time carefully selecting them. And no one does this anymore. We think that there's a speed to which we all have to work. But if you spend more time thinking about planning the environment, the context, the data that you have, the audiences that you actually need to reach, or the ones that you don't want to, you can end up being 10 times more effective than rushing through from brief to plan in 15 days and just being like, 50% of the budget is decided, this is decided. Like, let's get back to the art of what our jobs are supposed to be doing. So if anything, Chelsea, the thing that I've learned the most of is to go back to the hallmark things that I know early on in my career from a planner perspective, which is slow down, because it's not your money, and do the right thing to connect with human beings, because digital is a means to connect with them. You still need to understand people.
Yeah. Wow. All clients need a Sarah. That's for sure. They need a Sarah leading the charge for sure. So finally, I know you've been working on a campaign supporting public health, and I'd love to hear more about that. And given, its sensitivity of the topic, how do you think about approaching that in a way that's most impactful and responsible, in the work that you're doing?
When we inherited, and by no fault of the previous agency, but when we inherited the report that they had done, we saw they didn't do the heavy lifting. And the heavy lifting for us was looking beyond things like time spent, but really digging into the audience segments that were the most at risk and understanding not just the channels that they spent time on, but what did they trust? What did they deem as high quality? What was the content within those platforms that they engaged with the most, including creators? So it required us to look at it as like, where do I get scale? Where do I get efficiency when I work with particular audiences? Where are the intersections of media habits amongst these audiences? And then how do I understand it? And we're dealing with a public health issue. That is one that is very nuanced and complicated. And you can quite easily decide to take like a health and wellness perspective to it, but that would miss on the nuance of what these audiences actually spend time with and who they spend time with. So we did a lot of that. And most campaigns of this size, you would end up with something maybe around like 10 or 12 media partners. We ended up with, I think, over 60, maybe even 70 media partners. That's community radio. We did print because magazines is having a resurgence. We did social channels and platforms, working with you guys to make sure that we were targeting very carefully and choicefully across all the platforms that we're doing, because if you did a straight up like self-serve campaign, you can be hijacked really quickly in some of these places if you're not paying attention. So being very careful about those choices so that we're effective. We by all means did not have infinite budget. We had to make sure that there were two goals that we were achieving. One, that people remembered the message, and two, when they responded to the post-campaign analysis, that they said that the message was relevant to them. And the message relevant to them, if you are part of the Indigenous community or BIPOC or middle-aged men or young women or young Asian men, that is a very different thing that we needed to make sure we were in the right context for every single one of those audiences. Mm-hmm. So that required us to be much more complicated in our channel mix, but much more thoughtful about the context that we were in for all of them.
Yeah, it's so important. Mindful media, that's really what it is at the end of the day, and it's so important with such a sensitive topic. Looking ahead, what do you hope this campaign unlocks for how the industry shows up for underrepresented communities more broadly?
I think my number one component of this is first that marketers spend a little bit more time thinking about the audiences that they're excluding when they're doing a campaign as much as what they're including. Because there's a lot of nuance, and if you just do the law of average, you are probably missing out on a business opportunity to intersect with an audience. Because as much as it's scale, top down, it's also nuance bottom up of the context. So to me, it's not losing sight of that. And I think the final part of this is you can be in a platform and you can target against an interest, but isn't it even better if you're in a context that elevates your brand? And that's where the heavy lifting actually comes into place. Because I've seen campaigns run, in particular on YouTube, where, it was a very efficient CPM. But then when you look at the long list of like channels that you're in or context, do you actually want to be in those? Like, you got a view, but is that the place your brand actually wants to be in? Or is there elevated or creator content that you wanted to be in front of? To me, it's going back to mindfulness and intention.
Yeah.
Where you put your money 100% matters as an advertiser, and it shouldn't be a set it and forget it. And going back to the art of planning, because there's no data set in an AI reality that actually is inclusive of all human beings, because most of those data sets were only written by some for some.
Yeah. And I'm curious, how does search come into all of this? Do you place an importance on that with the theme of intentionality? Like someone intentionally, searching for something that they need help with, no matter what that is. I from my own experience, would search all the time about, am I a lesbian? How do I know if I'm a lesbian? What do I tell my parents? How do I approach them? Things like that. And I feel like that could resonate here. With that intentional searching for answers.
I think in this case for this campaign, search is important, but it was also partnering with Google in that regard because it's a public health issue.
Yeah.
The one area that we actually decided not to do for this campaign was we didn't do any programmatic display.
Okay.
Which feels like, I remember sitting with my planner on this campaign. I'm like, did we just decide that we're not doing anything in a DV360 type reality? And the answer to that was yes, but it was based on intention. We decided that it would be better for us to do more direct insertion and work directly with core critical publishers than chasing audiences around the internet in areas and spaces that we didn't really want to be in. Yeah. And then we also built a sort of a reaction approach for us in a digital space that if there was a crisis, we have a playbook to be able to address that. But we went with much more video.
Yeah.
Creators that we wanted to work with in the right context, in the right environments, and then there was a regionality perspective to that as well. So search was important to us, but more important was what we decided not to be in.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. Well, thank you so much. If there's nothing else, this was an amazing conversation, an extremely important one. That we'll continue doing the work towards together in our careers. I just want to say thank you so much for your time and the work that you're doing on this campaign, and we're here to support you always in your efforts.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Channel Factory for this opportunity.